Within 8 weeks, Marcus had lost his six-figure job. His wife had filed for divorce, and he'd watched in horror as I transferred the deed to my entire estate to Isabella Rodriguez, a young single mother he'd never met who now owned everything he thought was rightfully his, while I moved into the most luxurious senior living community in California, finally free from the son who'd spent decades making me feel like a burden in my own home. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe and tell me in the comments. Have you ever had an adult child treat you like you were an inconvenience in your own home, making you feel guilty for simply existing while they plotted to benefit from your hard work? Share your story below, because today you're going to learn that sometimes the family members who think you're too old and weak to fight back are about to discover they just made the most expensive mistake of their lives. This story is about the moment when I realized that my own son, the child I'd raised as a single mother, put through private school and college, supported through 2 failed businesses, and welcomed back into my home during his divorce, had been systematically working to push me out of my own house while convincing himself and others that he was doing me a favor by managing my affairs. When I discovered that the son I'd sacrificed everything for had been treating my home like his inheritance while I was still very much alive, competent, and legally entitled to live my life on my own terms. My name is Eleanor Catherine Whitman, and at 70 years old, I thought I was living the dream retirement in my beautifully restored 1920s Victorian home in Pacific Heights, San Francisco, a house I'd purchased in 1987 for $340,000 and had spent 35 years transforming into a showcase property now worth $1.2 million. This wasn't just any house. It was a 4-story architectural gem with original hardwood floors, stained glass windows crafted by local artisans, decorative crown molding throughout every room, and a rooftop garden that overlooked the Golden Gate Bridge, representing not just my life's work, but my identity as someone who'd built something meaningful and lasting through sheer determination and careful planning. The house stood as a testament to what was possible when a woman refused to accept limitations imposed by circumstances beyond her control. Every room told a story of gradual improvement and thoughtful investment. The kitchen I'd renovated in 2003 with custom cherry cabinets and granite countertops. The master bathroom I'd expanded in 2010 with a clawfoot tub and heated marble. Floors. The 3rd-floor study I'd converted into a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that housed my collection of medical texts and classic literature. And the rooftop garden where I'd spent countless evening hours tending to heirloom roses and organic vegetables that had provided both beauty and practical sustenance. More importantly, this house represented my independence as a woman who'd raised my son Marcus as a single mother after my husband David died in a construction accident when Marcus was only 8 years old. For 37 years, I'd been both mother and father, working double shifts as a registered nurse at UCSF Medical Center while attending night school to earn my bachelor's degree in nursing administration, eventually becoming the head of surgical services and building the kind of career that had provided security, respect, and substantial financial resources in one of the most demanding professions in healthcare. My nursing career hadn't been just a job. It had been a calling that had defined my identity and shaped my understanding of human nature in ways that would serve me well in the battle that was coming. Starting as a floor nurse in the cardiac intensive care unit, I'd learned to make split-second decisions under extreme pressure, to read people's motivations accurately, and to recognize when someone was trying to manipulate or deceive me for their own benefit. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, I'd worked my way up through the nursing hierarchy at UCSF, one of the most prestigious medical centers on the West Coast. As charge nurse, I'd supervised teams of healthcare professionals during some of the most challenging periods in modern medical history. I'd worked through the AIDS crisis when fear and uncertainty had tested everyone's professional competence and personal courage. I'd coordinated emergency response during the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, when our hospital had become a critical trauma center for earthquake victims. I'd managed staffing during budget crises, equipment shortages, and administrative reorganizations. that had required diplomatic skill and strategic thinking. By 2010, I'd been promoted to Director of Surgical Services, with responsibility for managing a department budget of $12 million annually and overseeing the work of 85 nurses, technicians, and support staff across 8 different surgical specialties. My colleagues had consistently recognized my leadership, abilities, my clinical expertise, and my talent for solving complex problems while maintaining high standards of patient care and staff satisfaction. Eleanor has the rare combination of clinical excellence, administrative skill, and emotional intelligence that makes her invaluable to our organization, Dr. Michael Rodriguez, the Chief of Surgery, had written in my final performance review before retirement. She consistently demonstrates the kind of professional excellence and personal integrity that defines what nursing leadership can be at its best. The respect I'd earned throughout my career hadn't been based on politics or favoritism. It had been built on 42 years of consistent performance, ethical behavior, and the kind of competence that had made doctors, administrators, and colleagues trust my judgment in situations where lives were literally at stake. The house that Marcus had begun to covet wasn't just a piece of real estate. It was the physical manifestation of decades of financial discipline, strategic planning, and personal sacrifice that had transformed a young widow's modest nursing salary into substantial wealth. Understanding how I'd built my financial security is crucial to understanding why Marcus's eventual betrayal was so devastating and why my response would be so comprehensive and devastating. When David had died in 1986, I'd been left with a $45,000 annual nursing salary, a $85,000 mortgage on our modest home in the Richmond district, $12,000 in savings, and an 8-year-old son who would need financial support for the next 15 years. The life insurance settlement had provided $150,000, enough to pay off our existing mortgage and provide a small emergency fund, but nowhere near enough to guarantee long-term security for Marcus and me. Most single mothers in my situation would have focused on survival, paying bills, covering basic expenses, and hoping for the best. But my nursing training had taught me to think systematically about problems and develop comprehensive solutions rather than just addressing immediate symptoms. I'd approached our financial situation like a complex medical case that required careful diagnosis, strategic treatment planning, and long-term monitoring to ensure successful outcomes. My first decision had been to use David's life insurance, money not for immediate comfort, but for long-term investment in our future security. Instead of buying a larger home or more comfortable lifestyle, I'd purchased the Victorian fixer-upper in Pacific Heights for $340,000. A property that required substantial work but was located in a neighborhood with excellent schools, strong property values, and the potential for significant appreciation over time. The house had needed everything: new plumbing, updated electrical systems, foundation repairs, roof replacement, and complete interior renovation. But I'd seen the investment opportunity that others had missed. A structurally sound property in a prime location that could be improved gradually over time while providing stable housing for Marcus and me. For the next 15 years, I'd worked double shifts whenever possible, picking up overtime hours and holiday assignments that had paid premium rates, while other nurses had preferred to spend time with their families. Every extra dollar had gone toward house improvements, Marcus's education expenses, or investments that would compound over time to provide long-term security. "Mom, you work too much," Marcus had often complained during his teenage years when I'd missed school events or family activities because of my demanding schedule. "Other kids' parents aren't always at the hospital. Everything I'm doing is for your future," I'd explained to him countless times. "The sacrifices we're making now will give you opportunities that other children don't have. Someday you'll understand why these choices matter." By 2000, when Marcus had graduated from high school, our financial situation had been transformed through my systematic approach to wealth building. The house had been renovated room by room and was worth $650,000. I'd maximized my contributions to the hospital's 403B retirement plan and had built an additional investment portfolio worth $180,000 through consistent monthly contributions to index funds and blue-chip stocks. More importantly, I'd saved $120,000 specifically for Marcus's college education, money that would allow him to attend UC Berkeley without student loans while living in a nice apartment and focusing on his studies rather than working part-time jobs to cover expenses. Marcus James Whitman had been my pride and joy since the day he was born on March 15, 1978, 3 years after I'd married his father David during my second year of nursing school. David had been a union electrician with steady work and a gentle personality that had made him a wonderful husband and devoted father, spending his evenings helping Marcus with homework and his weekends teaching him practical skills like woodworking, bicycle repair, and basic electrical work. When David had died in that construction accident, 8-year-old Marcus had lost not just his father, but his primary male role model and the stable family structure that had provided security and normalcy. During his early childhood, the grief had been devastating for both of us, but I'd been determined to ensure that Marcus's future opportunities wouldn't be limited by his father's absence. Becoming a single mother at 28 had been the most challenging experience of my life, but it had also revealed strengths I'd never known I possessed. Balancing full-time work with single parenthood while pursuing my bachelor's degree had required a level of organization, determination, and sacrifice that had shaped every aspect of our family life for the next 17 years. "Mom, you're like a superhero," 8-year-old Marcus had told me one evening when I'd arrived home from a particularly difficult shift at the hospital, still needing to help him with homework and prepare dinner. "You can do anything." That child's faith in my capabilities had motivated me through every challenge we'd faced together. Financial stress when money was tight, academic pressure when Marcus had struggled with certain subjects, social difficulties when he'd felt different from classmates who had two-parent families, and emotional challenges when he'd grieved for the father he'd lost too early. But as Marcus had grown older, his appreciation for my sacrifices had gradually transformed into expectations. That seemed to increase rather than diminish as our financial situation had improved. The child who'd once marveled at my ability to manage everything had become a teenager who'd taken my competence for granted while becoming increasingly demanding about the lifestyle he'd believed he deserved. I'd poured everything I had into ensuring Marcus had every possible opportunity for success. Private tutoring when he'd needed academic support, summer enrichment programs at Stanford and UC Berkeley that had cost thousands of dollars, music lessons for piano and guitar that had continued even when he'd lost interest, participation in youth soccer leagues that had required expensive equipment and travel to tournaments, and eventually, full financial support for his college education, including not just tuition, but also a generous monthly allowance that had allowed him to live comfortably without working. "Mrs. Whitman, Marcus is incredibly fortunate to have such dedicated support," his high school guidance counselor had told me during our college planning meetings. "The opportunities you've provided have prepared him for success at the most competitive universities. His academic record, extracurricular activities, and standardized test scores reflect the kind of comprehensive preparation that only comes from substantial family investment." Throughout high school, Marcus had excelled academically while building an impressive resume of activities that had positioned him for admission to top universities. He'd maintained a 3.8 GPA in honors and AP courses, had been captain of the debate team, editor of the school newspaper, and president of the computer science club. His college application essay had been about the importance of perseverance and the role that his mother's example had played in shaping his understanding of hard work and determination. "My mother taught me that success comes from consistent effort and never accepting limitations imposed by circumstances beyond your control," he'd written. "She showed me that one person's dedication and planning can overcome almost any obstacle and create opportunities that seemed impossible." I'd been so proud of that essay, so convinced that David and I had succeeded in raising a son who understood and embraced the values that had guided our family through every challenge. Marcus had been accepted to UC Berkeley's engineering program with a partial merit scholarship, and I'd eagerly provided the additional financial support needed to make his education possible without any student debt. Marcus's college years at UC Berkeley had been marked by academic excellence and social success, but they'd also been the period when I'd first noticed subtle changes in his attitude toward money, family obligations, and his expectations for his future lifestyle. The grateful, hard-working teenager I'd raised had gradually transformed into a young man who'd seemed to view financial support as an entitlement rather than a privilege that required appreciation and responsibility. During his freshman year, Marcus had lived in the residence halls and had seemed to appreciate the college experience I'd made possible for him. His phone calls home had been filled with enthusiasm about his courses, his professors, and the friendships he'd been developing with other engineering students. He'd maintained excellent grades while participating in study groups, engineering, competitions, and social activities that had enriched his college experience. "Mom, Berkeley is everything I hoped it would be," Marcus had told me during one of our weekly phone conversations. "The professors are incredible. The facilities are state-of-the-art, and I'm learning so much. Thank you for making this possible for me." But by his sophomore year, when Marcus had moved into an expensive apartment near campus with 3 roommates, his conversations had begun focusing more on lifestyle complaints and requests for additional financial support rather than gratitude for the opportunities I'd already provided. "Mom, the meal plan food is terrible, and eating out is really expensive," Marcus had complained during one phone call. "Could you increase my monthly allowance so I can buy better groceries and eat at decent restaurants occasionally? Mom, all my friends have cars, and it's really inconvenient to depend on public transportation for everything," he'd said during another conversation. "I found a used Honda that I could buy for $8,000. Could you help me with that? Mom, I need a better computer for my engineering coursework, and the campus computer labs are always crowded," he'd explained when requesting money for a $2,500 laptop that had far exceeded the capabilities required for his academic work. Each request had seemed reasonable in isolation, and I generally agreed to provide the additional support because I'd wanted Marcus to focus on his studies rather than worrying about financial constraints. But looking back now, I can see that my willingness to meet his increasing demands had established a pattern of entitlement that would eventually metastasize into the belief that my resources existed primarily for his benefit. "Eleanor, you're incredibly generous with Marcus," my friend and fellow nurse Patricia Chen had observed during one of our coffee meetings when I'd mentioned the latest financial request. "But I hope you're teaching him to appreciate what you're providing. Some children who receive too much support without earning it can develop unrealistic expectations about money and family obligations." At the time, I'd dismissed Patricia's concerns as overly cautious. Marcus was earning excellent grades, staying out of trouble, and seemed to be developing the kind of professional skills that would lead to career success and financial independence. The temporary support I was providing during his college years had seemed like a worthwhile investment in his future capabilities and earning potential. By his senior year, Marcus had been earning a 3.9 GPA in computer science, with a minor in business administration, had completed competitive internships with tech companies in Silicon Valley, and had received multiple job offers from prestigious firms before graduation. His academic and professional achievements had validated my investment in his education while demonstrating that he'd developed the technical skills and work ethic that would serve him well throughout his career. Marcus has exceptional technical abilities and strong leadership potential, his senior project advisor had told me during graduation ceremonies. His combination of programming skills, analytical thinking, and communication abilities will make him very successful in the technology industry. You should be incredibly proud of what you've accomplished in raising such a capable young man. After graduation, Marcus had quickly landed a position as a software engineer with Pinnacle Technologies, a mid-sized firm that specialized in developing enterprise software solutions for financial services companies. His starting salary had been $75,000. excellent for a new graduate, and he'd seemed excited about beginning his professional career and achieving the financial independence that would allow him to build his own life. For the first few years, Marcus had appeared to be thriving professionally and personally. He'd received regular promotions and salary increases, had developed expertise in emerging technologies that had made him valuable to his employers, and had seemed to be building the foundation for long-term career success. He'd rented a nice apartment in Soma, had purchased a reliable car, and had established a social life with other young professionals who shared his interests in technology and outdoor activities. "Of course you can stay here," I'd told him immediately. "Family helps family during difficult times. You can take as long as you need to get back on your feet, and we'll work out a fair rental arrangement that helps you save money while covering my expenses." At the time, the arrangement had seemed like a perfect solution for both of us. Marcus could rebuild his finances without the pressure of expensive market-rate rent. I would have the security of having family nearby, and we could strengthen our relationship while sharing the beautiful home that represented my life's work and his eventual inheritance. What I hadn't anticipated was that Marcus's gratitude for my generosity would gradually transform into resentment about his dependence, and that his temporary financial crisis would evolve into a permanent sense of entitlement to my resources and decision-making authority. The son I'd raised to be independent and successful had returned home as a middle-aged man who'd begun to view my competence and autonomy as obstacles to his own comfort and security. But none of that had been apparent during those first few months when Marcus had moved back home. He'd seemed genuinely grateful for my support, had been respectful of my space and routines, and had appeared to be working hard to rebuild his career and restore his financial stability. The woman who'd spent 42 years dealing with people in crisis situations should have recognized the warning signs that Marcus's problems were deeper than temporary financial setbacks. But love, loyalty, and maternal optimism had blinded me to the reality that my son was developing attitudes and expectations that would eventually threaten everything I'd worked to build and protect. Sometimes the people you help the most become the ones who resent you for being strong enough not to need their help in return. Marcus was about to discover that the 70-year-old mother he'd begun to see as a burden was actually someone with the intelligence, resources, and determination to teach him exactly what happens when you mistake generosity for weakness. For the first 6 months after Marcus moved into my basement apartment in January 2020, our living arrangement had seemed like the perfect solution for both of our needs. Marcus appeared genuinely grateful for the opportunity to rebuild his finances in a comfortable, supportive environment, while I enjoyed having family nearby and felt good about providing meaningful help during his time of crisis. Marcus had been paying me $800 per month in rent, well below the $2,200 that a comparable apartment would have cost in our Pacific Heights neighborhood, while also contributing to utilities and helping with household maintenance tasks that had become more challenging for me to manage alone. The financial arrangement had been fair and sustainable, allowing Marcus to save approximately $1,400 monthly toward paying down his divorce-related debt while providing me with modest income and valuable assistance. "Mom, I can't tell you how much this arrangement means to me," Marcus had said during one of our early conversations about the living situation. "Having a safe, comfortable place to rebuild my life while staying connected to family has made all the difference in my recovery from the divorce. You're giving me exactly what I need to get back on my feet." During those early months, Marcus had seemed like the son I'd always been proud of. Respectful, helpful, and focused on rebuilding his life through hard work and responsible financial management. He'd maintained excellent performance at his new job as a senior project manager with Innovate Solutions, a growing software company that specialized in cloud-based business applications for healthcare organizations. Marcus's technical expertise and leadership abilities had quickly been recognized by his new employer, and he'd received praise from supervisors and colleagues who'd appreciated his ability to manage complex projects while mentoring junior developers. His starting salary had been $145,000 annually, a significant increase from his previous position. and he'd seemed optimistic about his career prospects and financial recovery. "Work is going incredibly well," Marcus had told me during one of our regular evening conversations on my rooftop garden, where we'd often shared dinner while watching the sunset over the Golden Gate Bridge. "My supervisor says I'm exceeding expectations, and there's already talk about promotion opportunities. I feel like I'm finally back on track professionally." The basement apartment had been beautifully appointed with furniture from Marcus and Jennifer's former home, artwork that reflected his sophisticated taste, and technology that supported both his work-from-home days and his personal interests in gaming and entertainment. The space had felt like a genuine home rather than temporary housing, and Marcus had seemed to take pride in maintaining it well while respecting the boundaries that preserved my privacy and independence. Our daily routines had developed naturally and comfortably. Marcus typically left for work around 7:30 a.m., while I enjoyed my morning coffee and planned my day's activities. Evenings often included shared meals when our schedules permitted, conversations about our respective work and interests, and occasional movie nights when we'd both felt like relaxing together. "It's so nice to have meaningful conversations with someone who understands both professional challenges and family relationships," I told my friend Patricia during one of our weekly coffee meetings. "Marcus has matured so much through his difficulties, and I feel like we're developing an adult friendship alongside our mother-son relationship." The arrangement had also provided practical benefits that had enhanced both our lives. Marcus had helped with household tasks that had become more difficult for me to manage alone, changing light bulbs in high fixtures, moving heavy furniture, for cleaning, maintaining the rooftop garden during winter months, and handling minor repairs that would have required expensive contractor visits. In return, I'd provided home-cooked meals that had been far superior to anything Marcus could have afforded in restaurants, laundry services that had saved him time and money, and the kind of domestic comfort that had supported his professional focus and emotional recovery from his divorce. "Your son is so fortunate to have such a supportive family relationship," Dr. Rachel Morrison, my primary care physician, had observed during one of my routine appointments when I'd mentioned our living arrangement. "Many people your age struggle with loneliness and isolation, while many people his age struggle with housing costs and family disconnection. You've created a situation that benefits everyone involved." But what I hadn't recognized during those pleasant early months was that Marcus's gratitude was gradually being replaced by expectations, and that his temporary financial dependence was fostering resentment rather than motivation to achieve independence. The man who'd initially appreciated my generosity was slowly beginning to view my resources and decision-making authority as obstacles to his own comfort and convenience. The transformation in Marcus's attitude toward our living arrangement had been so gradual that I'd initially attributed small changes in his behavior to normal adjustments and temporary stress, rather than fundamental shifts in his character and priorities. Looking back now, I can see that the warning signs had been present much earlier than I'd recognized, but love and maternal optimism had made me explain away behaviors that should have concerned me. The first indication that something was changing had been Marcus's increasing commentary about my daily routines and household management decisions. Comments that had initially seemed like casual observations had gradually become more frequent and more critical, suggesting that he'd been developing opinions about how I should be living my life in my own home. "Mom, don't you think you're working too hard in the garden?" Marcus had asked one Saturday morning when he'd found me tending to my rooftop vegetable beds. "You're 70 years old. Maybe it's time to hire someone to handle the more physical aspects of gardening. These are my therapeutic supplements, but they're probably too expensive," he'd commented when he'd noticed my monthly order from the vitamin company I'd used for years. "There are generic alternatives that would provide the same benefits for half the cost. You really don't need to drive to the grocery store every few days," he'd suggested when he'd seen me preparing for one of my regular shopping trips. "I could do a big weekly shopping for both of us and save you the trouble of those frequent errands." At the time, These comments had seemed like expressions of caring concern from a son who'd wanted to help his mother avoid unnecessary effort and expense. I'd appreciated his attention to my well-being and had even accepted some of his suggestions as reasonable ways to make our household more efficient. But gradually, I'd begun to notice that Marcus's suggestions consistently involved reducing my independence and increasing his control over household decisions. The son who'd once admired my competence and self-sufficiency was beginning to treat me like someone who needed supervision and guidance rather than respect and cooperation. The second warning sign had been Marcus's increasing interest in my financial affairs and estate planning arrangements. Questions that had initially seemed like natural family conversations had become more frequent and more detailed, suggesting that he'd been thinking about my assets and their eventual disposition more than seemed appropriate for someone who was supposedly focused on rebuilding his own financial independence. "Mom, have you updated your will recently?" Marcus had asked during one of our dinner conversations. "It's important to make sure all your legal documents reflect your current wishes and circumstances. What kind of investment returns are you getting on your portfolio?" He'd inquired when he'd seen financial statements on my kitchen counter. "The market has been so volatile lately. Maybe we should review your allocation to make sure you're positioned for the best possible outcomes. Have you thought about what you want to happen to the house if you ever need assisted living care?" He'd suggested during another conversation. "It would be smart to have a plan for managing the property and preserving its value for the family." These questions had seemed reasonable coming from an adult child who'd been concerned about his mother's long-term welfare and financial security. Many families have similar conversations about estate planning and elder care preparation, and I'd assumed that Marcus's interest reflected mature thinking about family responsibilities and future planning. What I hadn't understood was that Marcus's questions weren't motivated by concern for my well-being, but by anxiety about his own financial security and inheritance expectations. The man who'd failed at 2 business ventures and had lost substantial assets in his divorce was beginning to view my wealth as his safety net rather than my personal resource to use according to my own priorities and timeline. The third warning sign had been subtle changes in how Marcus spoke about our living arrangement and my role in his life. Language that had initially emphasized mutual benefit and temporary assistance had gradually shifted to focus on his needs and my obligations, suggesting that he was beginning to view our relationship as something I owed him, rather than something I chose to provide. "This arrangement is really working well for managing your household expenses," Marcus had said during one conversation, shifting focus from his benefits to mine. "Having someone reliable here to handle maintenance and security issues is probably worth more than the rent you're collecting. I'm glad I can be here to keep an eye on things." He'd mentioned another time when we'd been discussing a minor plumbing repair he'd handled. "You really shouldn't be dealing with these kinds of problems alone at your age. It's convenient that we can coordinate our schedules for grocery shopping and errands," he'd observed, making our separate activities sound like shared responsibilities that required his participation and approval. The language was subtle, but the implication was clear. Marcus was beginning to reframe our voluntary arrangement as something that benefited me more than him, and he was positioning himself as a caretaker whose presence was necessary for my well-being, rather than a tenant who was receiving generous assistance during his own time of need. By the fall of 2020, Marcus's suggestions about my lifestyle and decision-making had become more frequent and more insistent, crossing the line from helpful advice to controlling behavior that had made me increasingly uncomfortable in my own home. The son who'd once respected my independence and competence was treating me like someone who needed constant supervision and guidance. The first major boundary violation had occurred when Marcus had taken it upon himself to research and contact contractors for home maintenance projects without consulting me first. I'd discovered his unauthorized activities when a roofing company had called to schedule an estimate for work I'd never requested. "Marcus, why are contractors calling me about roof inspections?" I'd asked when he'd returned from work that evening. "I noticed some loose shingles that could cause water damage if they're not addressed." he'd replied, as if his concern justified making decisions about my property without my knowledge or consent. I thought it would be smart to get professional assessments before the winter storms arrive. I appreciate your concern, I'd said, trying to remain calm despite my irritation. But this is my house, and I need to be consulted before anyone contacts contractors on my behalf. If there are maintenance issues, we can discuss them, and I'll decide how to handle them. Marcus's response had been the first clear indication that his attitude toward my autonomy had fundamentally changed. Instead of apologizing for overstepping boundaries, he'd become defensive and had suggested that my reaction was unreasonable. "Mom, I'm just trying to help you maintain the property value and prevent expensive problems," he'd said, his tone suggesting that I was being ungrateful for his initiative. "Someone needs to keep track of these things, and you can't handle everything yourself anymore." The phrase, "you can't handle everything yourself anymore," had been particularly troubling because it suggested that Marcus had made judgments about my capabilities without any evidence that I was struggling with household management. In fact, I'd been maintaining the property successfully for decades and had well-established relationships with reliable contractors for any work that required professional expertise. The second boundary violation had involved Marcus's attempts to involve himself in my medical appointments and healthcare decisions. He'd begun asking detailed questions about my doctor visits, medication regimens, and health status that had gone far beyond normal family concern and had felt like surveillance rather than care. "How did your appointment with Dr. Morrison go?" Marcus had asked after one of my routine checkups. "Did she have any concerns about your blood pressure medication or cognitive function? Are you remembering to take your vitamins consistently?" He'd inquired another time, as if I were a child who needed monitoring rather than an adult who'd been managing my own health care for 70 years. "Maybe I should start coming to your doctor appointments," he'd suggested during a conversation about my upcoming annual physical. "It's important to have an advocate who can ask the right questions and remember all the details." These suggestions had been particularly offensive because they'd implied that I was no longer capable of managing my own healthcare relationships or understanding medical information. As a retired nurse with 4 decades of healthcare experience, I was far more qualified to navigate medical systems and understand treatment options than Marcus was, and his patronizing attitude had been both insulting and concerning. The third major boundary violation had been Marcus's unauthorized review of my financial documents and his subsequent attempts to influence my investment decisions. I'd discovered that he'd been looking through my financial statements when he'd made specific comments about investment performance and account balances that he couldn't have known without accessing my private paperwork. "Mom, I noticed that your portfolio has been pretty conservative lately," Marcus had said during dinner one evening. "You might be missing opportunities for better returns with some of the tech stocks I've been following. Maybe we should schedule a meeting with your financial advisor to discuss some adjustments." "How do you know about my portfolio allocation?" I'd asked, realizing that he must have been examining documents that I'd never shared with him. "I just happened to see some statements on your desk when I was upstairs," he'd replied, as if casual snooping through my private financial information was perfectly acceptable. "I wasn't trying to pry, but I care about your financial security, and I want to make sure you're getting the best possible advice." The violation of my privacy had been bad enough, but Marcus's assumption that he should have input into my investment decisions had been even more troubling. I'd been managing my finances successfully for decades, had built substantial wealth through careful planning and professional guidance, and had no need for advice from someone who'd lost money on failed business ventures and had accumulated substantial debt through poor decision-making. "Marcus, my financial affairs are private, and I don't need your input on investment decisions," I'd said firmly. "I have excellent professional advisors, and I'm completely capable of managing my own portfolio. Please don't look through my personal documents again." Instead of apologizing for violating my privacy, Marcus had become defensive and had suggested that family members should be transparent about financial matters to ensure proper planning and coordination. I'm just trying to make sure you're protected and that the family wealth is being managed properly, he'd said, revealing his assumption that my assets were family wealth rather than my personal property to manage according to my own judgment and priorities. As Marcus's attempts to control my daily activities and decision-making had become more obvious and intrusive, I'd begun to notice that he was also systematically working to limit my social connections and independent activities. The isolation campaign had been subtle at first, but had gradually become more aggressive, as Marcus had apparently realized that my friendships and outside activities provided perspective that might help me recognize his manipulative behavior. The first aspect of the isolation campaign had involved Marcus's increasing criticism of my longtime friendships and his suggestions that my social activities were becoming burdensome or inappropriate for someone my age. Comments that had initially seemed like casual observations had become more frequent and more negative, suggesting that he was trying to undermine my confidence in relationships that had been important sources of support and enjoyment. Your friend Patricia seems to have a lot of opinions about other people's family situations, Marcus had said after one of my coffee meetings with my former nursing colleague. I hope she's not filling your head with unnecessary concerns about our living arrangement. Do you really need to go to book club every week? He'd asked when he'd seen me preparing for one of my regular literary discussions. It seems like a lot of effort for something that's basically just social gossip. Maybe you should limit your volunteer activities at the literacy center, he'd suggested when I'd mentioned my tutoring schedule. You're doing too much for other people when you should be focusing on your own needs and family relationships. These comments had been particularly hurtful because they'd attacked activities and relationships that had been central to my identity and happiness during retirement. My friendships with other healthcare professionals, my participation in intellectual discussions through book clubs, and my volunteer work with adult literacy programs had provided meaning, purpose, and social connection that had enriched my life and kept me engaged with my community. Marcus's criticism of these relationships and activities had seemed motivated by jealousy rather than concern. He'd been resentful that I had sources of validation and perspective that didn't depend on his approval or participation. The son who'd once been proud of my active social life and community involvement was trying to convince me that these connections were problematic or excessive. The second aspect of the isolation campaign had involved Marcus's attempts to position himself as my primary social connection and decision-making partner. He'd begun inserting himself into conversations with my friends, accompanying me to activities where his presence wasn't wanted or needed, and speaking on my behalf in situations where I was perfectly capable of representing myself. I'll handle scheduling the carpet cleaning, Marcus had said when my housekeeper had mentioned that my living room carpet needed professional attention. Mom shouldn't have to deal with coordinating these kinds of services. Let me talk to the contractor about the garden irrigation system, he'd offered when I'd been planning improvements to my rooftop garden. I can make sure you get fair pricing and quality work. I can drive Mom to her medical appointments from now on, he'd told Dr. Morrison's office when they'd called to confirm my quarterly visit. She shouldn't be driving alone to important medical appointments. These interventions had been presented as helpful assistance, but they'd actually been designed to insert Marcus into relationships and activities where he could monitor my conversations and influence other people's perceptions of my independence and capabilities. By positioning himself as my representative and caretaker, Marcus had been trying to create the impression that I needed supervision and support rather than respect and autonomy. The third aspect of the isolation campaign had been Marcus's systematic efforts to discourage visitors and social activities in our home. Comments about inconvenience, noise, and disruption had been designed to make me feel guilty about maintaining the social connections and hospitality that had always been important aspects of my personality and lifestyle. Your friend Eleanor's visits are pretty disruptive to my work-from-home schedule, Marcus had complained after one of my bridge partners had spent an afternoon playing cards and catching up on neighborhood news. The noise travels through the house and makes it hard for me to concentrate during important video conferences. "Do you really need to host book club here next month?" he'd asked when I'd been planning to have my literary group meet in my living room. "That's a lot of people and activity for you to manage, and it's stressful for me to have strangers in the house. Maybe we should limit dinner guests to immediate family," he'd suggested when I'd been planning a small dinner party for some former colleagues. "Large gatherings are a lot of work for you, and I worry about the security implications of having too many people in the house." These complaints had been particularly manipulative because they'd combined fake concern for my well-being with claims about his own needs and comfort. Marcus had been trying to make me feel guilty about maintaining social connections, while also suggesting that my social activities were becoming burdensome or inappropriate. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Marcus's escalating control campaign had been his systematic efforts to create and document supposed evidence of my declining health and mental capacity. The strategy had been sophisticated and calculated, involving manufactured medical concerns, exaggerated reports of minor incidents, and attempts to involve healthcare professionals in validating his claims about my diminished capabilities. The medical concerns campaign had begun with Marcus's increasingly frequent comments about my physical health and his suggestions that normal signs of aging were actually symptoms of serious medical problems that required intervention and supervision. Every minor stumble, moment of forgetfulness, or sign of physical fatigue had been treated as evidence of significant decline rather than normal variations in daily energy and attention. "Mom, I'm worried about your balance," Marcus had said after I'd momentarily steadied myself while getting up from a low garden chair. "You seem to be having more trouble with stability lately. Maybe we should schedule an appointment with a neurologist to rule out any serious issues." "You've been forgetting things more often," he'd observed when I'd asked him to remind me about a scheduled maintenance appointment. "Last week you forgot about your dentist appointment, and yesterday you couldn't remember whether you'd taken your morning vitamins. These memory lapses could be signs of cognitive decline. Your hands shake sometimes when you're pouring coffee," he'd pointed out during breakfast one morning. "That could indicate neurological problems that need medical evaluation. We should mention it to Dr. Morrison during your next appointment." These observations had been particularly manipulative because they'd taken normal, minor variations in physical and mental function and had reframed them as symptoms of serious medical conditions that required intervention. Every 70-year-old person occasionally forgets minor details, experiences momentary balance adjustments, or has slight hand tremors due to caffeine, fatigue, or normal aging. But Marcus had been cataloging these incidents as if they were evidence of significant decline. The second aspect of the medical concern strategy had involved Marcus's attempts to involve my healthcare providers in validating his concerns about my condition. He'd begun requesting to accompany me to medical appointments, had prepared lists of supposed symptoms and incidents to discuss with my doctors, and had tried to position himself as a reliable reporter of my health status. "I'd like to start coming to Mom's appointments so I can provide additional information about symptoms she might not remember or think to mention," Marcus had told Dr. Morrison's office when scheduling my routine physical. "I'm with her every day, and I've noticed some changes that could be medically significant. Here's a list of incidents and symptoms I've observed over the past few months," he'd said during my appointment, producing a written document that had detailed supposed memory lapses, balance problems, and confusion episodes that had been either exaggerated or completely fabricated. "I'm concerned that these could indicate early-stage dementia or other neurological conditions. I think Mom needs more comprehensive cognitive testing," he'd suggested to Dr. Morrison. "She's been making some questionable decisions about finances and household management that suggest her judgment might be impaired." The manipulation had been sophisticated because Marcus had presented himself as a concerned family member who was advocating for appropriate medical care while actually trying to create medical documentation that would support future claims about my incompetence and need for supervision. By involving healthcare professionals in his fabricated concerns, He'd been attempting to establish medical justification for the control he wanted to exercise over my life and assets. As Marcus's behavior had become more controlling and manipulative, throughout 2021, I'd begun to understand that his actions weren't motivated by genuine concern for my well-being, but by specific objectives related to gaining control over my property and financial assets. The patterns of behavior that had initially seemed like overprotective care had actually been strategic moves designed to position him as my necessary caretaker and eventual successor in managing my affairs. The first clear indication of Marcus's property-related objectives had been his increasing involvement in household maintenance decisions and his attempts to establish himself as the primary decision-maker for home improvement projects. Comments about necessary repairs, updates, and modifications had become more frequent and more insistent, suggesting that he was thinking about the property as his future inheritance rather than my current home. The house really needs a new roof. Within the next few years, Marcus had said during one of our conversations about property maintenance, we should start getting estimates and planning for that expense. It's important to maintain the property value for long-term financial planning. The electrical system in the upper floors should probably be updated to modern standards, he'd suggested another time. It's a safety issue, and it would also be necessary for any future property improvements or renovations. We should consider converting the third floor into a separate rental unit, he'd proposed during a discussion about household expenses. The rental income could help offset your costs and provide additional investment returns on the property. These suggestions had been presented as practical recommendations for maintaining and improving the property, but they'd actually been designed to establish Marcus's authority over decisions about my home, while positioning major renovations as family investments rather than my personal choices about my own living environment. The second indication of Marcus's financial control objectives had been his increasing pressure for me to involve him in investment decisions and estate planning discussions. His suggestions about portfolio management, financial advisor meetings, and legal document updates had become more frequent and more specific, revealing that he'd been developing detailed ideas about how my assets should be managed and eventually distributed. Your current investment allocation is too conservative for someone with your longevity and family obligations, Marcus had said during one of our financial discussions. You should be thinking about maximizing returns to ensure there's sufficient wealth for the next generation. We need to update your will and power of attorney documents to reflect current circumstances, he'd suggested during another conversation. Your existing documents are outdated, and they don't address the complexity of your current financial situation. I should be designated as your backup decision-maker for financial and medical matters, he'd proposed during a discussion about emergency planning. As your closest family member and the person most familiar with your situation, I'm the logical choice to handle these responsibilities if they become necessary. These suggestions had revealed Marcus's assumption that he should have significant input into my financial management and that he should be positioned to assume control over my assets and decision-making authority when the opportunity arose. The man who'd failed to manage his own business finances successfully was trying to establish himself as the appropriate manager of my substantial wealth. By early 2022, the cumulative effect of Marcus's controlling behavior, boundary violations, isolation attempts, and property-focused manipulation had created an atmosphere of tension and discomfort that had made me feel like a stranger in my own home. The son I'd raised to be independent and respectful had become someone who treated me like an incompetent burden, who needed constant supervision, and whose independence was an obstacle to his own comfort and security. The daily experience of living with Marcus had become increasingly stressful as every conversation had become an opportunity for him to criticize my decisions, question my capabilities, or suggest changes to my lifestyle and priorities. The man who'd once appreciated my generosity was treating my home like his property and my resources like his inheritance, while positioning himself as my caretaker rather than my tenant. I think we need to have a serious conversation about your future living arrangements, Marcus had said during one particularly tense discussion about household management. This house is becoming too much for you to handle alone, and you need to start thinking about more appropriate options for someone your age. Your social activities and volunteer commitments are becoming excessive, he'd complained during another conversation. You're wearing yourself out with too many obligations, and it's not sustainable for someone in your condition. Your financial decisions aren't as sound as they used to be, he'd suggested when I'd mentioned a charitable donation I'd planned to make. You need someone with better judgment to help you avoid making mistakes that could jeopardize your long-term security. The condescending tone and controlling content of these conversations had made it clear that Marcus no longer viewed me as his competent, independent mother who deserved respect and autonomy, but as an elderly burden whose independence was an inconvenience that needed to be eliminated for his own comfort and benefit. But what Marcus hadn't understood was that the 70-year-old woman he was trying to manipulate and control was actually someone who'd spent 42 years dealing with people in crisis situations, who'd developed sophisticated skills in recognizing manipulation and deception, and who'd built substantial resources and professional relationships that could be mobilized to protect her interests when necessary. The retired nurse who'd managed hospital departments and navigated complex medical emergencies wasn't going to be easily intimidated by a middle-aged son who thought he could manipulate his mother into surrendering her independence and assets. Marcus was about to discover that his systematic campaign to control my life had actually been preparing me to recognize his true character and motivations, and to respond with consequences he'd never anticipated. The foundation, Marcus thought, he was undermining was actually the platform from which I would launch a response that would teach him exactly what happens when you mistake maternal love for maternal weakness. The woman he dismissed as a declining burden was about to demonstrate that experience, intelligence, and financial resources could be very effective weapons when deployed by someone who'd finally realized they were under attack. Sometimes people who think they're gradually gaining control over your life are actually giving you time to understand their true character and prepare an appropriate response. Marcus had been so focused on positioning himself as my necessary caretaker that he'd forgotten I was still the same person who'd built a successful career, accumulated substantial wealth, and raised him to be the kind of man he'd apparently decided not to become. The breaking point was approaching, and when it arrived, Marcus was going to learn that some people fight back with consequences that last a lifetime. By March 2022, Marcus's interest in my financial affairs had evolved from occasional suggestions to systematic surveillance and increasingly aggressive attempts to insert himself into every aspect of my economic decision-making. What had initially seemed like a son's natural concern for his mother's financial security had become a comprehensive campaign to establish his authority over my assets, while documenting supposed evidence of my diminished capacity to manage my own affairs. The transformation had been gradual but unmistakable. Marcus had progressed from asking general questions about my portfolio performance to demanding detailed explanations of specific investment decisions, from suggesting occasional meetings with my financial advisor to insisting that he should be included in all financial planning discussions, and from making casual comments about estate planning to preparing detailed proposals for how my assets should be restructured and managed. Mom, I've been thinking about your investment strategy, and I really think we need to schedule a comprehensive review with your financial advisor, Marcus had said during breakfast one Tuesday morning, his tone suggesting that this was a decision he'd already made rather than a suggestion he was offering. Your current allocation is way too conservative for someone with your longevity expectations and family obligations. I've researched some alternative investment opportunities that could significantly improve your returns, he'd continued, producing a folder of printed materials about high-yield investment programs that had looked suspiciously similar to the risky ventures that had cost him money during his failed business attempts. These private equity funds and cryptocurrency investments could double your portfolio value within 3 to 5 years. The suggestion that I should move my carefully managed, conservative investment portfolio into speculative ventures had been particularly alarming because it had revealed Marcus's fundamental misunderstanding of appropriate financial management for someone in my situation. As a 70-year-old retiree with substantial assets, my investment priority should have been capital preservation and steady income rather than aggressive growth strategies that could jeopardize my financial security. Marcus, I've been managing my investments successfully for decades, and I have excellent professional advisors who understand my goals and risk tolerance, I'd replied, trying to keep my voice calm despite my growing irritation with his presumptuous suggestions. I don't need to chase higher returns by taking unnecessary risks with my retirement security. Instead of accepting my response and respecting my financial autonomy, Marcus had become defensive and had suggested that my resistance to his ideas was evidence of the kind of rigid thinking that often affected elderly people who were losing their ability to adapt to changing circumstances. "Mom, you're being way too cautious for someone in your financial position," he'd argued, his tone becoming patronizing in a way that had made me feel like he was speaking to a confused child rather than his accomplished mother. "You have enough wealth to take some calculated risks that could provide much better outcomes for the family. Your current approach is actually harmful to our long-term financial planning." The phrase, "our long-term financial planning," had been particularly troubling because it had revealed Marcus's assumption that my assets were family resources that should be managed according to his priorities rather than my personal property to use according to my own judgment and timeline. The man who'd accumulated substantial debt through poor business decisions was trying to convince me that his financial expertise was superior to the careful planning that had built my wealth over decades. But Marcus's most disturbing financial manipulation had been his systematic efforts to gain access to my banking and investment accounts through a combination of technical surveillance and document theft. I'd first noticed the unauthorized access attempts when my bank had called to verify unusual online login activities from devices I'd never used. "Mrs. Whitman, we're calling to confirm some recent online banking activity that seems inconsistent with your normal patterns," the security representative from Wells Fargo had explained during a phone call that had initially confused me. "Someone has been attempting to access your accounts using correct login credentials, but from devices and locations that don't match your historical activity. I haven't been trying to access my accounts from any unusual devices," I'd replied, immediately realizing that someone else must have obtained my login information. "Can you tell me what kind of access was attempted and when these incidents occurred?" The bank's security investigation had revealed that someone had been systematically attempting to access my checking account, savings account, and investment account using my correct username and password, but from Marcus's laptop and smartphone, during times when I'd been away from the house for medical appointments, social activities, or volunteer work. The revelation that Marcus had been secretly accessing my financial accounts had been devastating, not just because of the privacy violation, but because it had demonstrated the calculated nature of his manipulation campaign. He hadn't been stumbling into boundary violations or making occasional mistakes in judgment. He'd been systematically stealing my personal information and monitoring my financial activities without my knowledge or consent. "Marcus, the bank called me about unauthorized access attempts to my accounts." I'd confronted him that evening when he'd returned from work. "They traced the login attempts to your devices. You've been accessing my banking information without my permission." His response had been even more disturbing than the initial violation. Instead of apologizing or expressing remorse for violating my privacy and trust, Marcus had become defensive and had tried to justify his actions as necessary monitoring to protect me from potential financial mistakes or fraudulent activity. "Mom, I was just checking to make sure everything looked normal," he'd said, as if surveillance of my private financial accounts was a reasonable precaution rather than a serious violation of my autonomy and privacy. "With all the scams targeting elderly people, someone needs to be monitoring your accounts for suspicious activity. I never gave you permission to access my financial information," I'd replied, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain calm. "Those accounts are private, and I don't need your monitoring or protection. Change my passwords immediately and never access my accounts again." Instead of complying with my clearly stated boundaries, Marcus had escalated his manipulative tactics by suggesting that my anger about his unauthorized access was evidence of the kind of irrational thinking that often indicated cognitive decline in elderly adults. "Your reaction is way out of proportion to the situation," he'd argued, turning my reasonable objection to his privacy violations into supposed evidence of my diminished mental capacity. "I'm just trying to help you, and you're treating me like a criminal." This kind of paranoid thinking could be a sign of early dementia. As Marcus's financial surveillance and control attempts had intensified, his efforts to isolate me from outside social connections and independent activities had become increasingly aggressive and systematic. What had begun as subtle criticism of my friendships and social commitments had evolved into a comprehensive campaign designed to eliminate sources of external validation and perspective that might help me recognize the manipulative nature of his behavior. The isolation strategy had multiple components, each designed to gradually reduce my connections to the outside world, while making me increasingly dependent on Marcus for social interaction, practical assistance, and emotional support. By systematically undermining my confidence in relationships and activities that had been central to my identity and happiness, Marcus had been working to create conditions where his presence and approval would become my primary sources of validation and security. The first aspect of the enhanced isolation campaign had been Marcus's escalating interference with my established social relationships. Phone calls from friends had been interrupted by his complaints about noise and disruption. Planned visits had been discouraged through his suggestions that entertaining guests was becoming too stressful for me to manage. Social activities outside the home had been criticized as unnecessarily risky or inappropriate for someone my age. "Your friend Patricia calls way too often," Marcus had complained after one of my regular phone conversations with my former nursing colleague. "She seems to have a lot of drama in her life, and I don't think her constant problems are good for your stress levels. Do you really need to drive to Eleanor's house for bridge games every week?" he'd asked when I'd been preparing for one of my regular card games with friends. "That's a lot of driving for someone your age, and I worry about your reaction time and night vision. Maybe you should skip book club this month," he'd suggested when I'd been preparing to host my literary discussion group. "You seem tired lately, and hosting events is probably more exhausting than you realize." These interventions had been particularly manipulative because they'd combined fake concern for my well-being with implied criticism of my judgment and capabilities. Marcus had been systematically attempting to convince me that activities I'd enjoyed for years were becoming burdensome or inappropriate, while positioning himself as the caring family member who was protecting me from my own poor decisions. The second aspect of the isolation campaign had been Marcus's attempts to control and monitor my communications with the outside world. He'd begun intercepting my mail, screening my phone calls, and inserting himself into conversations with service providers, healthcare professionals, and community organizations where I'd been involved as a volunteer or participant. "I'll handle scheduling your next medical appointment," Marcus had told Dr. Morrison's office when they'd called to confirm my quarterly visit. "Mom has been having some confusion with dates and times lately, so it's better if family members manage her appointments. Let me talk to the contractor about the garden irrigation repairs," he'd offered when a landscaping company had called about maintenance work I'd requested. "Mom doesn't always understand the technical details of these projects, and I want to make sure she doesn't get taken advantage of. I'll coordinate with the Literacy Center about Mom's volunteer schedule," he'd told the program coordinator when she'd called about my tutoring commitments. "Her health hasn't been great lately, so we need to make sure she's not overcommitting herself." These interventions had been designed to create the impression among my social and professional contacts that I was experiencing cognitive decline and needed family supervision for routine activities. By positioning himself as my necessary representative and caretaker, Marcus had been working to establish a public narrative that would support future claims about my incompetence and need for protective supervision. The third component of the isolation campaign had been Marcus's systematic efforts to undermine my confidence in my own judgment and decision-making abilities. Through constant criticism, contradictory advice, and suggestions that my choices were becoming questionable or harmful, he'd been working to convince me that I needed his guidance and approval for increasingly basic aspects of daily life. You sure you want to wear that outfit to your medical appointment? Marcus had asked one morning when I'd been dressed in clothing I'd considered perfectly appropriate for a routine doctor visit. You might want to choose something more conservative, so Dr. Morrison takes you seriously. I don't think you should drive to the grocery store today, he'd suggested when I'd been preparing for a routine shopping trip. The weather forecast mentions possible afternoon showers, and you shouldn't be driving in potentially dangerous conditions. Maybe you shouldn't make that donation to the literacy center right now, he'd said when I'd been preparing a check for my annual contribution to the organization where I'd volunteered. You should probably wait until we've reviewed your overall financial situation more carefully. These constant suggestions and corrections had been designed to create self-doubt about my capabilities, while positioning Marcus as the source of reliable judgment and appropriate guidance. The cumulative effect had been to make me question decisions I'd been making successfully for decades while becoming increasingly dependent on Marcus's approval and direction. Perhaps the most disturbing escalation in Marcus's manipulation campaign had been his increasingly sophisticated efforts to create medical documentation that would support claims about my cognitive decline and need for protective supervision. What had begun as casual comments about my health and suggestions for additional medical attention had evolved into a systematic campaign involving multiple healthcare providers and fabricated evidence of mental and physical deterioration. Medical manipulation had multiple objectives, each designed to establish legal and medical justification for Marcus to assume control over my healthcare decisions, financial management, and living arrangements. By creating an official record of cognitive decline and diminished capacity, Marcus had been working to build a foundation for guardianship proceedings that would give him legal authority over every aspect of my life, while making it appear that his intervention was medically necessary rather than financially motivated. The first component of the medical manipulation had been Marcus's systematic documentation of supposed symptoms and incidents that he'd either exaggerated dramatically or fabricated entirely. Using his technological skills and attention to detail, he'd created comprehensive records of alleged memory lapses, confusion episodes, balance problems, and decision-making errors that he'd planned to present to healthcare professionals as evidence of my declining condition. I've been keeping track of Mom's symptoms because I'm really concerned about her cognitive function, Marcus had told Dr. Morrison during my annual physical examination, producing a typed document that had listed dozens of alleged incidents over the previous 6 months. She's been having frequent memory lapses, confusion about dates and appointments, difficulty with basic tasks like medication management, and some concerning changes in judgment and decision-making. The document had been sophisticated and convincing, with specific dates, times, and detailed descriptions of supposed incidents that had sounded medically plausible to someone who wasn't familiar with my actual daily functioning. Marcus had described episodes of forgetting family members' names, getting lost while driving familiar routes, leaving appliances on overnight, and making inappropriate financial decisions that had suggested significant cognitive impairment. Last, Tuesday, Mom couldn't remember my name for several minutes, one entry had claimed. She seemed confused about who I was and asked me multiple times why I was in her house. On March 15th, Mom got lost driving to her regular grocery store and couldn't remember how to get home, another entry had alleged. A neighbor had to help her find her way back, and she seemed very disoriented and frightened. Mom has been leaving the stove on overnight and doesn't remember cooking meals, a third entry had documented. Yesterday, I found her trying to cook the same meal 3 times because she'd forgotten that she'd already eaten dinner. Every item on Marcus's list had been either a complete fabrication or a dramatic exaggeration of minor normal incidents that he'd reframed as symptoms of serious cognitive decline. The occasional moment of forgetfulness that every 70-year-old person experiences had been transformed into evidence of dementia. Minor navigation errors that everyone makes had been described as getting lost and disoriented. Normal variations in daily routine had been characterized as dangerous confusion and poor judgment. The second component of the medical manipulation had been Marcus's attempts to influence my healthcare provider's assessments and recommendations through his role as my accompanying family member and primary reporter of my health status. By positioning himself as a reliable witness to my condition and an advocate for appropriate medical intervention, he'd been working to convince doctors that I needed more comprehensive evaluation and possibly protective care arrangements. "I think Mom needs more extensive cognitive testing," Marcus had suggested to Dr. Morrison during my appointment. "The symptoms I've documented suggest that her condition might be progressing faster than previous assessments indicated." "Has Mom mentioned any of these incidents to you?" he'd asked, implying that my failure to report his fabricated symptoms was evidence of either poor memory or deliberate concealment of my problems. "She doesn't seem to recognize how serious some of these episodes have been. I'm worried about Mom's safety living alone," he'd continued, despite the fact that I wasn't living alone and was demonstrating complete competence in managing my household and personal affairs. "These cognitive changes are affecting her judgment about basic safety issues like cooking, driving, and medication management." The manipulation had been particularly effective because Marcus had presented himself as a concerned family member who was advocating for appropriate medical care, rather than someone who was working to manufacture evidence of my incompetence for his own benefit. Healthcare providers had naturally been inclined to take his report seriously and to err on the side of caution when evaluating potential cognitive decline in an elderly patient. As Marcus's isolation and medical manipulation campaigns had progressed, throughout the spring of 2022, his ultimate objectives regarding my property and financial assets had become increasingly explicit and aggressive. What had initially been presented as helpful suggestions about home maintenance and financial planning had evolved into systematic attempts to establish his control over my house, while positioning major changes as necessary adaptations to my declining capabilities rather than his desire to control valuable assets. The property takeover strategy had been sophisticated and multifaceted, involving legal research, contractor consultations, and financial planning that had revealed the depth of Marcus's preparation for assuming control over my real estate. He'd apparently been developing detailed plans for months, researching legal procedures for property transfers, investigating renovation options that would maximize property value, and identifying potential rental income strategies that would benefit his financial situation. The first indication that Marcus had developed specific plans for my property had been his increasingly frequent meetings with contractors, real estate agents, and legal professionals that he'd initially attempted to conceal from me. I discovered these activities when service providers had begun calling to follow up on consultations and estimates that I'd never requested or authorized. "This is Henderson Roofing calling to confirm your appointment tomorrow for the roof replacement." "Estimate," the contractor had said during a phone call that had immediately confused me. "Your son Marcus scheduled the consultation, but we wanted to verify the appointment time directly with the homeowner." "I didn't schedule any roofing estimates," I'd replied, realizing that Marcus had been making arrangements for work on my property without consulting me. "I need to speak with my son about this before any appointments are scheduled." Similar calls had followed from painting contractors, landscape architects, interior designers, and real estate appraisers, all reporting that Marcus had requested consultations for work or evaluations related to my property. The pattern had revealed that Marcus had been systematically researching property improvements, valuations, and potential modifications without my knowledge or consent. When I'd confronted Marcus about these unauthorized consultations, his response had been revealing and disturbing. Instead of apologizing for overstepping boundaries or seeking permission for future activities, he'd defended his actions as necessary planning for property maintenance and had suggested that my objection to his initiative was evidence of poor judgment and resistance to appropriate home care. "Mom," This house needs significant updates and maintenance that you're not recognizing or addressing, Marcus had argued, his tone implying that I was being negligent about property care rather than appropriately maintaining my home. Someone needs to take responsibility for preserving the property value and ensuring that necessary work gets done. I've been maintaining this property successfully for 35 years, I'd replied, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain calm. I have established relationships with reliable contractors, and I don't need your unauthorized consultations or planning. This is my house, and I'll make decisions about maintenance and improvements. Marcus's response had been the clearest indication yet that he'd been thinking about my property as his future inheritance rather than my current home. Instead of respecting my authority as the homeowner, he'd escalated his argument by suggesting that my property management decisions were affecting his financial interests and future security. Your property decisions impact the entire family, he'd said, revealing his assumption that my house was family property rather than my personal asset to manage according to my own priorities. You're not thinking about property values, tax, implications, or estate planning considerations that affect everyone who will eventually inherit this house. The second component of Marcus's property strategy had been his systematic research into legal procedures for property transfers, guardianship arrangements, and power of attorney provisions that would allow him to assume control over my real estate. I'd discovered this research when I'd found legal documents and online search histories on his laptop computer, which he'd left open in the living room after one of his research sessions. The browser history had revealed extensive searches for topics including elderly parent property transfer, guardianship procedures California, power of attorney real estate authority, and incompetent parent property management. The search terms had made it clear that Marcus had been researching legal mechanisms that would allow him to gain control over my property through claims about my diminished capacity rather than waiting for normal inheritance procedures. The legal documents I'd found had been even more disturbing, including printed articles about conservatorship procedures, downloaded forms for property transfer arrangements, and detailed information about the legal standards for declaring someone incompetent to manage their own affairs. Marcus had been methodically researching the legal framework he would need to bypass my property rights and assume control over my real estate. The culmination of all Marcus's manipulation campaigns had come during what I'd believed was a celebration of my 70th birthday in August 2022. What should have been a joyful family dinner had instead become the setting for the most devastating betrayal I'd ever experienced, revealing the complete scope of Marcus's deception and his ultimate intentions for my future. The dinner had been Marcus's idea, presented as a special celebration to honor my birthday and our successful living arrangement over the past 2.5 years. He'd suggested a nice restaurant in downtown San Francisco, followed by a return to the house for dessert and family conversation. The plan had seemed thoughtful and appropriate, and I'd been looking forward to a pleasant evening with my son. "Mom, I want to make your 70th birthday really special," Marcus had said when proposing the dinner plans. "You've been so generous and supportive during my difficult period, and I want to show you how much I appreciate everything you've done for me. This is a big milestone birthday, and we should celebrate it properly." The restaurant he'd chosen had been elegant and sophisticated, with excellent food and attentive service that had made the early part of the evening enjoyable. Marcus had seemed relaxed and charming, sharing stories about his work, asking about my volunteer activities, and expressing appreciation for our family relationship in ways that had reminded me of the son I'd raised and loved. "I'm so grateful for the stability and support you've provided during my recovery from the divorce," Marcus had said during dinner, his tone seeming genuine and heartfelt. "Living in your beautiful home has given me the foundation I needed to rebuild my career and my confidence. I don't know how I would have managed this transition without your generosity." The conversation had continued pleasantly throughout dinner, with Marcus asking about my retirement activities, my friendships, and my future plans in ways that had seemed like normal family discussion, rather than the surveillance and information. Gathering that I now realize had been his actual purpose. But the atmosphere had changed dramatically when we'd returned to the house for dessert and continued conversation. Marcus had opened a bottle of expensive wine that he'd purchased for the occasion, and we'd settled in the living room with birthday cake and coffee for what I'd expected to be a relaxing conclusion to a lovely evening. "Mom, there are some things we need to discuss about your future," Marcus had begun, his tone shifting from celebratory to serious in a way that had immediately made me uncomfortable. "I've been thinking a lot about your living situation, your health, and your long-term care needs." The transition from birthday celebration to serious family discussion had felt jarring and inappropriate, but I'd assumed that Marcus had legitimate concerns that he'd wanted to address in a private, comfortable setting. Nothing in his behavior during dinner had prepared me for the devastating revelations that were about to unfold. "Your health and cognitive function have been declining more rapidly than you seem to realize," Marcus had continued, producing the folder of fabricated medical documentation that he'd been compiling for months. "I've been documenting incidents and symptoms that suggest you're developing early-stage dementia or other neurological conditions that are affecting your judgment and decision-making abilities." The accusation had been shocking and hurtful, but what had followed had been even more devastating. Marcus had proceeded to outline detailed plans for my future that he'd apparently been developing without my knowledge or input, plans that would have stripped me of my independence, my property, and my autonomy while positioning him as my caretaker and decision-maker. "I've researched several excellent assisted living facilities that specialize in memory care," Marcus had explained, producing brochures and cost information for institutions I'd never heard of and had no interest in considering. "Sunset Manor in Marin County has an excellent reputation and a beautiful setting. You'd have professional care and supervision while I manage your financial affairs and property." The suggestion that I needed institutional care had been insulting and frightening, but Marcus's assumption that he would manage my financial affairs and property had revealed the true motivation behind his months of manipulation and control attempts. He hadn't been concerned about my well-being. He'd been positioning himself to assume control over my assets while making it appear medically justified. "I don't need assisted living care, and I don't need you to manage my affairs," I'd replied, my voice shaking with a combination of anger and disbelief. "I'm completely competent to make my own decisions about my life, my health, and my property. I can't believe you've been planning this behind my back." Marcus's response had been the moment when his true character had been fully revealed. Instead of backing down or apologizing for his presumptuous planning, he'd escalated his attack by suggesting that my resistance to his plans was evidence of the cognitive decline that justified his intervention. "Mom, your reaction right now is exactly what I'm talking about," Marcus had said, his tone becoming condescending and manipulative. "You're not thinking clearly about your situation, and you're not capable of making rational decisions about your care and safety. Someone needs to take responsibility for protecting you from your own poor judgment." But the worst was yet to come. As I'd continued to resist his plans and assert my right to make my own decisions about my life, Marcus had finally revealed the depth of his resentment and contempt for me in words that would haunt me forever and would destroy any remaining possibility of reconciliation between us. "Go die already, you worthless old hag!" Marcus had screamed, his face contorted with rage and his voice filled with years of suppressed resentment. "You're nothing but a burden who's too stubborn and selfish to accept that your time is over. I've wasted 2.5 years of my life taking care of someone who should have had the decency to move into a nursing home years ago." The words had hit me like physical blows, not just because of their cruelty, but because they'd revealed that everything I'd believed about our relationship had been a lie. The son I'd raised with love and sacrifice, the man I'd supported through his failures and welcomed into my home during his crisis, had been viewing me as a burden and an obstacle to his own comfort and inheritance expectations. "Stop being so fucking selfish and think about what's best for the family," Marcus had continued, his rage making him completely abandon any pretense of caring concern. This house should have been mine years ago, and your stubborn refusal to accept reality is ruining everyone's future planning. In that moment, standing in my beautiful living room while my son screamed hatred and resentment that had apparently been building for years, I'd finally understood the complete scope of his betrayal and the true nature of the person I'd raised and loved. The man who'd benefited from every sacrifice I'd made had become someone who viewed my independence as an obstacle and my continued existence as an inconvenience to his financial planning. But what Marcus didn't know was that the 70-year-old woman he'd just revealed his true feelings about was someone who'd spent 42 years dealing with people in crisis, who'd developed sophisticated skills in strategic thinking and problem-solving, and who'd built substantial resources and professional relationships that could be mobilized to respond to threats and betrayals. The retired nurse who'd managed complex medical emergencies and hospital department budgets wasn't going to be destroyed by a middle-aged son who thought he could intimidate his mother into surrendering her life and assets. Marcus had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and he was about to discover exactly what happened when you underestimated someone who'd spent decades dealing with people who thought they were smarter and more powerful than everyone else in the room. Sometimes the people who think they've been carefully positioning themselves to control your life have actually been giving you all the information you need to destroy theirs. Marcus's birthday dinner revelation had finally shown me who he really was, and now it was time for him to learn who I really was when someone threatened everything I'd worked to build and protect. The breaking point had been reached, and the consequences were about to begin. The morning after Marcus's devastating birthday dinner outburst, I woke up in my bedroom with a clarity of purpose I hadn't experienced since my nursing days, when a medical emergency required immediate, decisive action to save a patient's life. The shock and heartbreak of discovering my son's true character had been replaced by the cold, analytical thinking that had served me well throughout my career when dealing with people who thought they could manipulate, intimidate, or deceive me. Lying in bed at 5:30 a.m., watching the early morning light filter through the stained glass windows I'd lovingly restored over the years, I realized that Marcus's cruel revelation had actually been a gift. For months, I'd been confused by his changing behavior, hurt by his controlling attitude, and uncertain about how to respond to his boundary violations. But his screamed declaration that I was a worthless old hag who should go die already had finally shown me exactly who he was and what he deserved. The son I'd raised with love and sacrifice had become a predator who viewed my independence as an obstacle and my continued existence as an inconvenience to his inheritance planning. The man I'd supported through his failures and welcomed into my home during his crisis had been systematically working to destroy my autonomy while convincing himself that his manipulation was justified. But what Marcus had fatally miscalculated was the character and capabilities of the woman he'd decided to target. As I made my morning coffee and sat in my kitchen overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge, I began developing a response strategy that would demonstrate exactly what happened when a failed businessman tried to manipulate a woman who'd spent 42 years managing complex situations and difficult people. The retired nurse who'd handled medical emergencies, managed million-dollar budgets, and supervised teams of healthcare professionals was about to teach Marcus the most expensive lesson of his life about respect, consequences, and the difference between maternal love and maternal weakness. But my response wouldn't be emotional or reactive. It would be systematic, comprehensive, and completely devastating, designed to ensure that Marcus faced appropriate consequences for his betrayal while protecting me from any future attempts at manipulation or control. The foundation of trust and family loyalty that had made his deception possible would become the platform from which I would launch a counterattack that would destroy everything he'd been working to steal. My first priority had been to protect my assets and legal rights from any future attempts by Marcus to implement his guardianship and property control plans. Drawing on my decades of experience with healthcare bureaucracy and legal procedures, I'd understood that the best defense against Marcus's manipulation would be comprehensive documentation of my competence, combined with legal barriers that would make it impossible for him to access my resources or challenge my decision-making authority. That Monday morning, I'd made my first call to Patricia Montoya, an elder law attorney whose name I'd found through the California Bar Association's referral service. Patricia specialized in cases involving family financial abuse and had extensive experience helping elderly clients protect themselves from manipulative relatives who were trying to gain control over their assets and autonomy. Mrs. Whitman, what you're describing sounds like a textbook case of family financial abuse, Patricia had said after I'd explained Marcus's behavior and his birthday dinner revelation. Your son appears to have been implementing a systematic campaign designed to isolate you, undermine your confidence, and create documentation that would support guardianship proceedings. The good news is that you recognized the manipulation before he could implement his plans. Patricia had outlined a comprehensive legal strategy that would include new estate planning documents, medical competency evaluations, financial account protections, and documentation of Marcus's unauthorized activities that could be used as evidence if legal proceedings became necessary. The key to protecting yourself is acting decisively while you have the element of surprise, Patricia had explained. Your son apparently believes that you're declining mentally and wouldn't be capable of mounting an effective response to his manipulation. We're going to show him exactly how wrong he is about your capabilities. Within 48 hours, Patricia had arranged for Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a geriatric psychiatrist and neuropsychologist, to conduct comprehensive cognitive and mental health evaluations that would provide definitive medical evidence of my competence and decision-making capacity. The testing had been extensive, including memory assessments, problem-solving exercises, psychological evaluations, and detailed interviews about my daily functioning and independence. Mrs. Whitman, you scored in the 98th percentile for cognitive function in your age group, Dr. Rodriguez had reported after completing her evaluation. You show no signs of dementia, cognitive impairment, or any mental health conditions that would affect your capacity to make decisions about your life, finances, or health care. Any claims to the contrary would be medically unsupportable and potentially fraudulent. The comprehensive medical documentation had been crucial because it had provided irrefutable evidence that I was mentally competent and capable of managing my own affairs, directly contradicting any claims Marcus might make about my supposed cognitive decline. More importantly, Dr. Rodriguez's report had specifically addressed each of the fabricated symptoms that Marcus had documented, explaining that his alleged incidents were either normal variations in daily functioning or complete fabrications, with no medical basis. Simultaneously, I'd worked with Patricia to create new estate planning documents that would protect my assets while reflecting my actual wishes rather than Marcus's assumptions about his inheritance rights. The new will had been designed to ensure that my resources would go to people and organizations that truly deserved them, while sending a clear message about the consequences of betraying someone who'd given you everything. Your new estate plan reflects your actual values and priorities, Patricia had explained as we'd reviewed the documents. It protects your assets from manipulation while ensuring that your legacy goes to causes and people who've earned your trust and support. While building my legal protections, I'd also been conducting a systematic investigation into the full scope of Marcus's deception and manipulation. Using the analytical skills I'd developed during my nursing career and the attention to detail that had served me well in managing complex medical cases, I'd begun documenting evidence of Marcus's unauthorized activities and fraudulent behavior that would support my response strategy. The investigation had revealed that Marcus's manipulation campaign had been far more extensive and sophisticated than I'd initially realized. His unauthorized access to my financial accounts had been just the beginning of a comprehensive scheme that had included identity theft, document forgery, and attempted fraud that could have resulted in substantial financial losses if I hadn't discovered his activities when I did. Working with my bank's security department, I'd obtained detailed records of Marcus's unauthorized account access attempts, including timestamps, device information, and specific activities that demonstrated the systematic nature of his surveillance and attempted theft. The documentation had shown that Marcus had been monitoring my account balances, transaction history, and investment activities for months while attempting to identify vulnerabilities he could exploit. Your son's access attempts show a clear pattern of escalating unauthorized activity, the bank security specialist had explained during our meeting. He started with simple balance inquiries, but gradually attempted more complex transactions, including investment transfers and account modifications. This type of activity typically indicates preparation for more serious financial crimes. But Marcus's banking violations had been only part of his criminal activity. I'd also discovered that he'd been using my personal information to contact my investment advisor, insurance companies, and other financial service providers while falsely representing himself as my authorized representative. The documentation I'd obtained from these companies had revealed multiple instances of attempted fraud and identity theft. Someone claiming to be your son called last month requesting detailed information about your investment portfolio and asking about procedures for transferring assets to family members. My investment advisor Robert Chen had told me when I'd inquired about any unusual contact. We didn't provide any information because we couldn't verify his authorization, but the questions suggested sophisticated knowledge of your financial situation. Similar calls had been made to my insurance companies, my bank's trust department, and the property management company that handled some of my real estate investments. In each case, Marcus had attempted to obtain confidential information or initiate transactions while falsely claiming to have power of attorney or other authorization to act on my behalf. The most disturbing discovery had been evidence that Marcus had been researching and potentially preparing to forge legal documents that would give him authority over my assets and decision-making. Computer forensics analysis of his laptop had revealed downloaded forms, research into legal procedures, and draft documents that suggested he'd been planning to create fraudulent power of attorney and guardianship papers. As my investigation had progressed and my legal protections had been established, I'd begun developing the response strategy that would teach Marcus the most devastating lesson possible about the consequences of betraying someone who'd given him everything. The plan that had emerged would not only protect me from future manipulation, but would demonstrate exactly what happened when someone mistook generosity for weakness. The inspiration for my ultimate response had come during one of my volunteer tutoring sessions at the San Francisco Literacy Center, where I'd been working with Isabella Rodriguez, a 28-year-old single mother who'd been struggling to complete her high school equivalency while working 2 jobs to support her 6-year-old daughter, Sophia. Isabella's story had been both heartbreaking and inspiring, representing everything admirable about determination, sacrifice, and the power of education to transform lives. Isabella had immigrated to the United States from El Salvador when she was 16, fleeing violence and poverty that had made education impossible in her home country. She'd worked in restaurants, hotels, and cleaning services while learning English and trying to create opportunities for herself and her daughter that hadn't existed in her previous life. "Mrs. Whitman, working with you has changed everything for me," Isabella had told me during one of our tutoring sessions. "You've helped me understand that education isn't just about passing tests. It's about developing the confidence to believe I can create a better future for Sophia and myself." Isabella's intelligence, work ethic, and determination had reminded me of my own younger self when I'd been struggling to build a career and raise Marcus as a single mother. But unlike Marcus, who'd taken every opportunity for granted and had eventually come to resent the person who'd provided them, Isabella appreciated every moment of support and was working to transform assistance into independence and success. Through our months of working together, I'd learned that Isabella was living in a small apartment in the Mission District with Sophia, paying $2,100 monthly rent that consumed more than half her income from working as a restaurant server and weekend house cleaner. Despite her financial struggles, Isabella had been saving money for Sophia's college education and had dreams of eventually becoming a registered nurse after completing her education and gaining legal residency status. "My dream is to help people the way you've helped me," Isabella had explained during one of our conversations about her future goals. "Nursing seems like the perfect profession for someone who wants to use their knowledge and skills to make a real difference in people's lives." The parallels between Isabella's aspirations and my own career path had been striking, but what had impressed me most had been Isabella's character and values. Despite facing challenges that would have defeated many people, she'd maintained optimism, integrity, and determination that had reminded me why I'd become a teacher and why education remained the most powerful tool for creating positive change in the world. As I'd observed Isabella's struggle and admired her character, I'd begun to understand exactly how I could respond to Marcus's betrayal in a way that would serve justice while also creating something positive and meaningful from the wreckage of our destroyed relationship. On September 15th, 2022, exactly 1 month after Marcus's birthday dinner revelation, I'd implemented the response that would teach him the ultimate lesson about respect, consequences, and the difference between earned inheritance and assumed entitlement. The plan I'd developed would not only protect me from future manipulation, but would demonstrate that actions have consequences, even when those actions are committed against someone you assume is powerless to fight back. That Tuesday morning, I'd met with Patricia Montoya and a notary public at the office of San Francisco Land Title Company, where I'd executed legal documents that would transfer full ownership of my $1.2 million Victorian home to Isabella Rodriguez, along with a substantial financial gift that would provide her with the security and opportunities that Marcus had, taken for granted and ultimately forfeited through his betrayal. "Mrs. Whitman, are you absolutely certain about this decision?" Patricia had asked one final time before we'd proceeded with the document signing. "This transfer is irrevocable, and it will completely change your son's expectations about his inheritance." "I've never been more certain about anything in my life," I'd replied, feeling a sense of peace and satisfaction that had been missing since Marcus's manipulation campaign had begun. Isabella has earned this opportunity through her character and determination, while Marcus has forfeited any claim to my generosity through his deception and betrayal. The deed transfer had been accompanied by a $200,000 cash gift that would allow Isabella to quit her second job, focus on completing her nursing education, and provide Sophia with educational opportunities that would have been impossible otherwise. The money had come from investment accounts that Marcus had been planning to control, making the gift particularly appropriate as a demonstration of how resources should be used to reward character rather than entitlement. "I've also arranged for a full scholarship fund that will cover Sophia's education through college," I'd explained to Isabella when we'd met to discuss the transfer. "Education is the most valuable gift anyone can receive, and I want to make sure Sophia has every opportunity to achieve her dreams." Isabella's reaction to the deed transfer and financial gifts had been everything I'd hoped for: gratitude, disbelief, and determination to honor the opportunity through continued hard work and service to others. Her response had confirmed my judgment about her character while providing the satisfaction of knowing that my resources would create positive change rather than enabling continued entitlement and manipulation. "Mrs. Whitman, I don't know how to thank you for this incredible generosity," Isabella had said, tears streaming down her face as she'd held the deed to her new home. "You've given Sophia and me opportunities we never could have imagined. I promise you that we'll use this gift to build something meaningful and to help other people the way you've helped us." Marcus had discovered the deed transfer on September 20th, when he'd returned from a business trip to find moving trucks in front of the house and Isabella directing the relocation of her belongings into what had been his assumed inheritance. The shock of learning that his birthright had been given to a stranger had triggered a complete psychological meltdown that had revealed the full extent of his entitlement and narcissistic assumptions about his place in my life. I'd been staying at the Fairmont Hotel while the transition had been completed, both to give Isabella space to settle into her new home and to avoid the confrontation that I'd known would be explosive and potentially dangerous. But Marcus's phone calls had provided plenty of evidence of his emotional state and his inability to accept responsibility for the consequences of his own actions. "What the fuck have you done?" Marcus had screamed in a voicemail message that had been so profanity-laden and threatening that I'd forwarded it to Patricia for potential use in legal proceedings. "You can't give away my inheritance to some random stranger. I'll have you declared incompetent and reverse this whole thing." "You're obviously having a psychotic break," he'd continued in another message. "No sane person would give away $1 million house to someone they barely know. This proves that you need immediate psychiatric intervention and protective supervision. I'm calling Dr. Morrison and telling her about your delusional behavior," he'd threatened in a third message. "Once she understands what you've done, she'll support my petition for emergency guardianship. You'll be in a nursing home by Christmas, and I'll reverse every one of these insane decisions." The messages had continued for hours, escalating in anger and threats while revealing Marcus's complete inability to understand that his own behavior had created the circumstances that led to his disinheritance. Instead of recognizing that his manipulation and betrayal had forfeited his claim to my generosity, he'd focused on trying to undo the consequences through continued manipulation and legal threats. But Marcus's greatest miscalculation had been his assumption that I'd acted impulsively or irrationally in transferring the property to Isabella. His attempts to have me declared incompetent had been immediately thwarted by the comprehensive medical and psychological evaluations I'd already completed, which had provided irrefutable evidence of my mental capacity and decision-making competence. "Your son's claims about your mental state are completely contradicted by the professional evaluations we've already completed," Dr. Rodriguez had told Marcus when he'd attempted to schedule an emergency psychiatric assessment. "Mrs. Whitman shows no signs of cognitive impairment or mental illness that would affect her decision-making capacity. Any legal challenges to her competence would be frivolous and potentially subject to sanctions." As Marcus had struggled to accept the reality of his disinheritance, the systematic documentation of his manipulation and attempted fraud had begun to create additional consequences that had extended far beyond the loss of his expected inheritance. The evidence I'd gathered during my investigation had provided the foundation for professional and legal accountability that had ensured Marcus faced appropriate consequences for his attempted crimes. The first major consequence had been Marcus's termination from his position at Innovate Solutions, which had occurred after the company's security department had investigated his unauthorized access to my financial accounts using company equipment. The IT forensics analysis had revealed that Marcus had been using his work computer and internet connection to research guardianship procedures, access my banking information, and communicate with service providers while misrepresenting his authority to act on my behalf. "We take any misuse of company resources for personal activities very seriously," Marcus's supervisor had explained during the termination meeting. "But using company equipment to commit identity theft and attempted fraud creates liability issues that make continued employment impossible." The termination had been particularly devastating because Marcus had been in line for a promotion to senior project manager that would have increased his salary to $165,000 annually. The loss of his income had created immediate financial pressure that had been compounded by his inability to find comparable employment due to the circumstances of his termination and the references that had reflected his fraudulent activities. The key, second major consequence had been the end of Marcus's marriage to his girlfriend Amanda Chen, whom he'd been dating for 8 months and had been planning to marry in the spring of 2023. Amanda had learned about Marcus's manipulation campaign and disinheritance through social media posts that had documented Isabella's remarkable story and my decision to transfer the property to someone who'd earned the opportunity through character and determination. I had no idea that Marcus had been systematically manipulating his mother and planning to steal her property, Amanda had told me during a phone conversation after she'd ended their relationship. "The man I thought I was going to marry turned out to be someone who would abuse an elderly family member for financial gain. I could never trust someone capable of that kind of betrayal. Amanda's decision to end their relationship had been particularly painful for Marcus because he'd been counting on her income and emotional support to rebuild his life after the divorce from Jennifer. The loss of both his employment and his romantic relationship had left him isolated and financially desperate in ways that had made his situation increasingly unstable. Perhaps the most satisfying aspect of Marcus's downfall had been the community response to learning about his attempted manipulation and the circumstances that had led to his disinheritance. The story of my deed transfer to Isabella had spread throughout our Pacific Heights neighborhood and my social circles, creating a narrative that had celebrated my strategic response while condemning Marcus's betrayal of family trust and values. The San Francisco Chronicle had published a feature article about my gift to Isabella, focusing on the inspiring story of an immigrant single mother who'd overcome tremendous challenges to pursue education and create opportunities for her daughter. The article had mentioned that the gift had come from a retired nurse who'd been inspired by Isabella's determination and character, but had also included enough details about family manipulation and betrayal to make Marcus's role in the story clear to anyone who knew our family situation. "Local woman's generosity transforms lives," the headline had read, with a photo of Isabella and Sophia in front of their beautiful new home. Retired nurse Eleanor Whitman's gift of property and education funding represents the kind of community support that makes the American dream possible for families willing to work for their goals. The article had generated dozens of supportive comments and social media shares that had praised my decision while criticizing adult children who took advantage of elderly parents' generosity. The community response had been overwhelmingly positive, with neighbors, former colleagues, and friends expressing admiration for my strategic thinking and satisfaction that Marcus had faced appropriate consequences for his manipulation. "Eleanor made exactly the right decision," my friend Patricia Chen had commented on the Chronicle's Facebook post. "Some adult children think they're entitled to their parents' assets regardless of how they treat the people who sacrificed for them. It's wonderful to see someone reward character and determination instead of enabling continued selfishness." The social consequences for Marcus had been immediate and comprehensive. Former friends and colleagues had learned about his attempted manipulation through the media coverage and social media discussions, creating professional and personal isolation that had made rebuilding his life exponentially more difficult. "I can't believe Marcus would try to manipulate his mother like that," his former colleague Sarah Morrison had posted on LinkedIn after learning about the situation. "Anyone capable of that kind of family betrayal can't be trusted in professional relationships either." While Marcus had been dealing with the consequences of his manipulation and betrayal, I'd been building the new life that his attempted control had inadvertently inspired me to create. The deed transfer to Isabella had been accompanied by my own relocation to a beautiful luxury senior living community in Marin County, where I'd purchased a stunning condominium that had provided independence, security, and social opportunities that had exceeded anything I'd experienced during my years in Pacific Heights. Oceania Senior Living had been everything I'd hoped for in a retirement community. Elegant accommodations, excellent amenities, and a vibrant community of active, intelligent residents who'd appreciated my nursing background and community involvement. The monthly fee had been substantial at $4,200, but my investment portfolio and pension income had provided more than enough resources to maintain my lifestyle while continuing to support educational causes and charitable organizations that reflected my values. "Eleanor, you've made such a positive impact on our community," the director of Oceania had told me after my first month of residence. "Your healthcare expertise and volunteer spirit have enriched everyone's experience here. We're so fortunate to have someone with your background and energy as part of our family." My new apartment had been beautifully appointed with furniture and artwork that I'd selected specifically for this phase of my life, creating a space that had been both elegant and comfortable while reflecting my interests in literature, travel, and intellectual discussion. The location had provided easy access to cultural activities in San Francisco, while offering the kind of community support and security that had been perfect for someone my age. Most importantly, the senior living community had provided social connections with people who'd shared my values about education, service, and intellectual curiosity. Bridge clubs, book discussion groups, volunteer opportunities, and cultural outings had created a rich social life that had been far more satisfying than the isolation and tension that had characterized my final months living with Marcus. You seems so much happier and more relaxed than when you first moved here, my new friend Margaret Thompson had observed during one of our regular walks around the community gardens. It's clear that leaving your previous living situation was exactly the right decision for your well-being and peace of mind. One of the most rewarding aspects of my new life had been maintaining a meaningful relationship with Isabella and Sophia that had provided purpose and joy while demonstrating the positive outcomes that could result from recognizing and rewarding good character. Unlike my relationship with Marcus, which had been built on obligation and had eventually been poisoned by manipulation and entitlement, my friendship with Isabella had been based on mutual respect and shared values that had continued to strengthen. Over time, Isabella had thrived in her new circumstances, using the financial security and educational support I'd provided to complete her nursing prerequisites while maintaining her focus on creating opportunities for Sophia's future success. Her gratitude had remained genuine, and her determination had been inspiring, validating my judgment about her character while providing the satisfaction of knowing that my resources were creating lasting positive change. Mrs. Whitman, starting. Nursing school next month feels like a dream come true, Isabella had told me during one of our monthly lunch meetings. Sophia and I wake up every morning grateful for the opportunities you've made possible. We're determined to honor your investment by working hard and eventually helping other families the way you've helped us. Sophia had adjusted beautifully to her new school and neighborhood, making friends quickly while maintaining the academic excellence that had characterized her education despite the challenges of her family's previous financial struggles. Her teachers had reported that she was thriving both academically and socially, and her excitement about learning had reminded me of the joy I'd experienced during my own teaching career. Sophia talks about you constantly, Isabella had shared during another conversation. She tells everyone that you're her honorary grandmother and that she wants to be a nurse just like you when she grows up. You've become such an important part of our family story. The relationship with Isabella and Sophia had provided the kind of intergenerational connection and purpose that I'd hoped to have with Marcus and any grandchildren he might have provided. But unlike my relationship with Marcus, which had become poisoned by his entitlement and manipulation, my friendship with Isabella's family had been built on appreciation, respect, and shared commitment to education and service that had created lasting bonds. The final confrontation with Marcus had occurred in November 2022, when he'd made one last attempt to convince me to reverse the deed transfer and restore his inheritance expectations. By that time, the cascading consequences of his manipulation campaign had left him unemployed, financially desperate, and socially isolated, creating circumstances that had made him increasingly unstable and potentially dangerous. Marcus had appeared at my new apartment complex unannounced, demanding to speak with me about what he'd called his unlawful disinheritance and threatening legal action if I didn't agree to transfer the property back to him. The encounter had been brief but revealing, demonstrating that Marcus still hadn't accepted responsibility for his own actions or recognized that his behavior had created the consequences he was experiencing. "Mom, you need to fix this situation immediately," Marcus had demanded when I'd agreed to speak with him in the community's visitor lounge. "I've lost my job, my relationship, and my future because of your irrational decision to give away my inheritance. You have to transfer the house back to me and provide financial support until I can rebuild my career." His continued assumption that I owed him anything after his attempted manipulation and betrayal had been both astounding and pathetic. Even facing the complete destruction of his life plans, Marcus had been unable to acknowledge that his own actions had created his circumstances, or to express genuine remorse for the pain and betrayal he'd inflicted on someone who'd given him everything. Marcus, the consequences you're experiencing are the direct result of your decision to manipulate and betray someone who loved you unconditionally, I'd replied, my voice calm but firm. You chose to view my independence as an obstacle and my generosity as weakness. Now you're learning what happens when someone like that encounters someone stronger than they realized. You're destroying our family over nothing, Marcus had shouted, his voice echoing through the elegant lounge and drawing concerned attention from other residents and staff members. I was just trying to help you plan for your future. Everything I did was motivated by concern for your well-being, the Sao. Continued lies and self-deception had been the final confirmation that Marcus was incapable of the kind of character growth that might have made reconciliation possible. His inability to accept responsibility or express genuine remorse had made it clear that any future relationship would simply provide opportunities for additional manipulation and abuse. Our family relationship ended the night you screamed at me to go die already, I'd said, standing to indicate that our conversation was finished. You revealed your true character that evening, and I responded accordingly. The consequences you're experiencing are permanent, and they're exactly what you deserve. Security had escorted Marcus from the premises after he'd continued shouting threats and accusations, and I'd obtained a restraining order that had prevented any future contact attempts. The legal document had provided the final protection I needed to ensure that Marcus could never again attempt to manipulate, intimidate, or control me. 2 years after the deed transfer that had changed everything, I was living the most fulfilling and peaceful life I'd experienced since David's death. The decision to transfer my property to Isabella had not only protected me from Marcus's manipulation, but had created opportunities for positive impact and meaningful relationships that had enriched my retirement in ways I'd never anticipated. Isabella had graduated from nursing school with honors and had begun working at UCSF Medical Center, where her compassion, intelligence, and dedication had quickly earned the respect of colleagues and supervisors. Her success had validated my judgment about her character, while providing the satisfaction of knowing that my gift had enabled someone deserving to achieve their dreams and serve others. Mrs. Whitman, I think about you every day when I'm caring for patients, Isabella had told me during our most recent lunch meeting. You taught me that education and service are the most meaningful ways to use whatever advantages you receive in life. I'm determined to live up to the example you've set. Sophia had continued to excel academically while developing into a confident, articulate young woman who understood the value of education and hard work. Her teachers had consistently praised her academic performance and character, and her dreams of following in my footsteps by becoming a healthcare professional had demonstrated that the values I'd tried to instill were being passed on to the next generation. My life at Oceania had continued to provide intellectual stimulation, social connection, and opportunities for community service that had kept me active and engaged well into my 70s. Leadership roles in resident committees, volunteer work with literacy programs, and mentoring relationships with other residents had given me purpose and meaning, while demonstrating that aging could be a time of continued growth and contribution rather than decline and withdrawal. Eleanor has transformed our community through her energy, wisdom, and commitment to helping others, the Oceania director had said during a recent community meeting. She embodies everything positive about aging with grace, purpose, and continued service to others. Standing on my apartment balcony overlooking the San Francisco Bay, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice, dignity, and the power of strategic thinking to overcome manipulation and betrayal. Marcus had learned too late that planning to exploit someone who'd spent decades dealing with manipulative people was the biggest mistake he'd ever made. He'd discovered that the elderly woman he'd tried to control was actually someone with the intelligence, resources, and determination to ensure that justice was served in ways he'd never anticipated. The most important lesson from my experience was that respect isn't optional in family relationships, that trust once broken can never be rebuilt, and that people who underestimate you based on your age or circumstances might be making the most expensive mistake of their lives. Sometimes the best thing that can happen is when someone pushes you far enough that you finally decide to push back with everything you have. If someone in your life is treating you like you're disposable, remember my story. Remember that you're never too old, never too weak, never too powerless to fight for what's rightfully yours. Remember that generosity should be appreciated rather than exploited, and that family relationships should be based on respect rather than entitlement. What's your story? Have you ever had to fight back against someone who thought you were helpless? Share it in the comments below, and remember to like and subscribe for more stories about turning your worst betrayal into your greatest victory. Because sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up teaching you exactly how strong you really are. And sometimes that strength is enough to ensure they never underestimate anyone like you ever again. The deed transfer was supposed to be impossible for someone like me to accomplish. Instead, it became the moment when I demonstrated that some people fight back harder than you ever expected. Marcus thought he was stealing my dignity, but what he actually did was help me discover that I was much more powerful than either of us had ever imagined. That's a lesson he'll have plenty of time to think about for the rest of his life. And for the rest of his existence, every time he considers taking advantage of someone he thinks is vulnerable, he'll remember the 70-year-old nurse who taught him that some people fight back with consequences that last forever. Justice served. Lesson learned. Power reclaimed. Sometimes the best revenge is simply showing people exactly who they were foolish enough to cross, while using your resources to create something beautiful and meaningful from the wreckage of their betrayal. The woman Marcus dismissed as a burden became the architect of his complete destruction, while building a legacy of education, opportunity, and empowerment that will continue long after both of us are gone. That's what real power looks like, not the ability to control others, but the wisdom to know when to fight back, and the strength to ensure that justice is served completely. Isabella and Sophia's success story will continue for generations, while Marcus's name will be remembered only as a cautionary tale about what happens when you mistake love for weakness and generosity for stupidity. Sometimes the best inheritance you can leave is a lesson that teaches people to treat others with respect, because the consequences of doing otherwise might be more devastating than they ever imagined possible.